of seizure, confiscation of properties, 13 incidents of extortion, and 4 incidents of sexual and gender-based violence, and 1 incident of discrimination in the distribution of food items. That, as a throwback to the palliative issue and all of that.
Was quite a robust session that Imoni anchored on the 24th of April. I think from the 24th of April, we moved. The next session was on the 28th of April, and that fell back on Nancy to moderate, and it was on COVID-19 recovery, interrogating the monetary interventions of the CBN and the fiscal policy initiatives of the federal government. There was also a context to this, Nancy.
Yes, there was, because at the beginning of this pandemic, of course, our first confirmed case was February 27th, if I'm not mistaken.
February 27th,
yes.
You're correct.
The Central Bank of Nigeria swung into action quickly, because I remember they did invite us like 2 times in 5 days, I think 2 weeks later. So we took a cue from that to do this panel, because the monetary policy or the monetary authority was the first perhaps to respond. I think the first measures came March 16th, if I'm not mistaken, where the central bank governor did announce 50 billion naira targeted credit facility to help households and businesses that are struggling. They also came up with, I think, 100 billion naira intervention facility for healthcare companies, pharmaceutical companies, and all of that. 5 days later, they came up also with a 1 trillion naira intervention for critical sectors around the economy, that's manufacturing.
The big companies.
Yes, the big companies and all of that, so that our economy will be recessed, definitely, but perhaps it shouldn't be as deep as we should expect. So the Town Hall Forum gathered both the central bank officials. We had the director of Development Finance Department, that's the main department where this is being arranged and distributed, so to speak. So we had Ayila Yusuf, the director, join us on the Town Hall Forum. He did also announce there that as at then, 28th of April, that 5 billion naira has been released from the TCF, the 50 billion naira targeted credit facility, as at that time, to 6,000 beneficiaries. But there's an update now, because of course this it's like 2 or 3 weeks after the town hall. I think the central bank governor did say, was this just some days ago, that the beneficiaries have grown to about 7,000 beneficiaries. So that's an update from where we were during that town hall. What I also took away from that town hall, because we had people across board join us. We had even the president of the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria join us. He did mention that some of their members have started assessing the facility, but there's still a need for more interaction and more communication. What I also took away from that, because after that town hall forum, I got a lot of calls. Even up till now, people still do not understand how they can take advantage of that facility.
And assess the
yes,
facility.
and assess the facility. Because we have a few intervention funds from the central bank, at least over the years. But for the 50 billion naira is targeted for companies and households that have been adversely affected by COVID-19 or the coronavirus pandemic. So they can assess like 3 million for households, then 5 million for businesses. Other economists also had, like Dr. Melafia, the former deputy governor of the central bank, he did also say that there's a need for us to take a cue from Brazil in fighting our poverty in Nigeria, because the MBS came up with statistics telling us that about 82.9 million Nigerians are poor. And you also do know that we are the world's poverty capital. Close to 100 million Nigerians are poor, living on less than $1.90 a day. So there was a consensus on that panel that we really need to shift. The structure of our economy needs to shift so that we can include more people, a lot more people can get jobs. A lot more people can have access to some of these intervention funds. A lot more people can, be involved, included economically. And what Dr. Fashoa was also on that panel, he did also say something that we should not look at the intervention funds as a national cake. I also need to say, because a lot of people will think, okay, They are loans, they shouldn't be returned. They are loans, they are not grants. It's not something, the government is not dashing you money. The government is expected that you use that money to
grow yourself.
To grow yourself, to rise.
To grow your business,
yes,
to
grow
stabilize,
your business, to stabilize.
And ensure that
yes, you refund the money and other people can also take advantage of it. So it's not a national cake, as it were.
I think one major issue that arose from that discussion was the fact about how these loans will peter down to the needy, to the ordinary small businesses and all of that, because it appeared it was targeted at only big businesses, and the smaller businesses.
No, for the smaller businesses, the 50 billion will cater for the smaller businesses. That's households and small businesses.
They were actually the first.
Yes, they were the first. That's the 50 billion naira targeted credit facility. That will go for the households, which is 3 million naira, then 5 million for the SMEs. For the SMEs, the MSMEs, the micro and the small businesses that want to be part of it. Let's also not forget that there's also another intervention they call the AXMEs. That one also is on. But for the 50 billion is precisely targeted because of the pandemic. The one you're also talking about is the 1 trillion for the big businesses in pharmaceuticals and in the healthcare, which some pharmaceutical companies have started taking advantage of. I think other key points from panelists looked at revenue options. Yes.
Okay, I think we'll take some of those highlights from the panelists, and you get to see them in a moment. Afterwards, let's bring you the next town hall session was on the 1st of May, Friday, 1st of May 2020. And it had to do with COVID-19 governance and containment strategy, lockdown compliance, interventions, and resource management. Imoni handled or moderated this particular panel, and it came from a context actually, because at that time we had started seeing agitation of people who said we are tired of staying at home.
Very
we are
much
hungry
so.
And we want to get out.
Very much so, and of course May 1st was also the Workers' Day, and although the pandemic will not allow workers celebrate the way they are used to celebrating, but of course it was clear that it was a Workers' Day, and the workers were feeling the pinch of the lockdown, and so against the backdrop of a speech made by former U.S. President Barack Obama, where he criticized world leaders for their what he described then as poor response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We then decided to look at governance issues. We looked at compliance issues because it was obvious from the reports that were harvested from around the country and even beyond that, people were not even complying with government guidelines and regulations on the lockdown. So many people felt that they had stayed home long enough, their businesses were suffering, their economy, as it were, was suffering, and so there were a number of violations of the government guidelines and rules. And so we sought to ask the questions at that session about have our leaders, or did our leaders as at that time demonstrate enough leadership in handling the emergency situation that we had on our hands at that time? Did they, or have they as at that time, made smart decisions about this COVID-19 crisis? And of course, there was also the issue of communication. Did government, or has government been very robust in its handling of the communication between government and the people,
using different channels and bridging whatever existing gaps,
and explaining this disease to the people, explaining why the lockdown was imposed in the first place and what it was intended to achieve? These were the questions we put out there, and we had a very robust discussion. We had people from the civil society organizations, we had people from the academia, we had people from even government, and we put all of these issues on the table, and the consensus during that session was the fact that yes, the Nigerian government had done very well at that time, but could have done much better in terms of leadership. There was a disconnect between what the federal government was doing at the center and what the states were doing, because it appeared as if the state, each state government had its own agenda, had its own guidelines. So you saw situations where some state governors would completely lock down their states and even declare, as I would put it, themselves independent republics, because before the interstate movement curfew was put in place by the federal government, they had in fact set out their own directives and said, look, you cannot come into our state, you cannot move out of our state, and so many of such things.
Well, they also wanted money from Abuja.
From Abuja, exactly.
You can fly, but you can land.
So there was this uncoordinated process. Even with the presidential task force in place, states were still doing what they liked. And I think it continued even after that town hall meeting. And even up to today, we are still seeing some discordant things here and there about governance, about leadership, and indeed compliance. In fact, after that town hall meeting was when the ease of lockdown came about, and we saw a lot more of disobedience to the guidelines, non-compliance, and all of that,
which we still experience up till today.
Especially with the safety protocols.
Precisely, Amaechi. I remember that immediately after the ease of lockdown was announced, the first 2-3 days, in my part of Abuja where I stay, there were policemen driving along, motorbikes moving slowly along, and anybody that they saw that didn't have a face mask on the street, they had to stop you and ask you to go back home or use your face mask. So those who had face masks in their pockets really had to pull it out. And even the marketplaces, women selling and hawking on the road were using their face mask. But right now, the narrative seems to be different. So the issue of compliance or non-compliance, we're still experiencing it up till now.
Very correct. Because in fact, you notice that some of that compliance in the city center.
Yes.
But the reports that we had before and after that town hall forum indicated that in the suburbs of even the federal capital, in the suburbs of Abuja, nobody was...
business as usual.
Yes, nobody was complying with those guidelines.
All right, we moved over to the next town hall, which held on Friday, the 22nd of May 2020. And that was anchored by Amaechi Anakwue. The topic was COVID-19 healthcare, medical response strategy, risk management, testing, foreign aid, local capacity, response facilities, and enabling environment. It was a very loaded session indeed, because the sub areas in it were quite very deep as well. Amaechi, how was that session for you?
Yes, you've read out the different thematic areas we did that issue for that day, but I can tell you medical response strategy and issue of testing dominated because it was key. The consensus was that yes, it was a novel coronavirus, still relatively strange to the World Health Organization. As the day goes by, the world is trying to understand the new virus, so it presented some new, fresh challenges never seen before. Most countries, most national governments were confused in articulating what the problem is and putting in place the proper response mechanism. It was even more manifest in Nigeria. Despite the fact, I recall I raised the question, did we not fall back on the Ebola virus experience? Of course, it was a similar, another viral disease, and they acknowledged, yes, we should have leveraged on that experience to effect better control in terms of the entire management. The first problem to identify was the inability of the federal government to shut down our borders. The signs were there, they said, but for some reason, perhaps the federal government keying into the position of the World Health Organization that is not necessary at that time, decided to allow our borders to remain open, and that was when most of the cases, those with travel history in countries that the virus is prevalent came in. And before then, those that they had contact with, and the numbers started ballooning. So the consensus was that we shut down our borders quite late. We locked down even quite late. We were 2 weeks behind, according to some of the panelists. This is preventable. So going forward is one of the experiences. Perhaps in future there will be further outbreak of viral diseases. And the next major issue that dominated that session was testing. All of us agreed that its key is at the very heart of containment of the COVID-19. Our testing capacity was quite low. There were some back and forth as to whether we had 3 or 5 molecular testing centers. At the time the outbreak happened, the U.S. Specialist Hospital, the one in Abuja of the NCDC and the one in Lagos, but 3 to 5 testing centers was clearly inadequate to test people, do contact tracing, isolation and treatment. Over time, the NCDC made it their priority to increase our testing capacity. As we speak now, the last time they told us 29 molecular
laboratory
centers across the country, and increasing the target of 2 million Nigerians to be tested in 3 months came under review. Is it possible that NCDC can meet this target, considering the fact that they are ramping up their testing capacity? But the numbers on that day, even by 22nd of May, wasn't quite encouraging. And the numbers today, just over 60,000, and we have 2 months to go to the end of that target. It's still far away. So a lot of blames were heaped on the successive governments for refusing to invest on our healthcare system. One measure, they said, of testing or knowing the adequacy of a national government's healthcare system is this diagnostic capacities and capabilities. You have to diagnose first, and it was quite low. Comparatively with Ghana, Egypt, South Africa, who were quite left behind. So going forward, we need to invest. They even had said much of the funds being donated for management of COVID-19 should go into installing and building up and expanding test capacity, not just the molecular apps. There are some other systems, ARP systems that not as sophisticated as molecular laboratory, but will go a long way in reaching a whole number of people. So these two dominated. We'll try to take a look at the issues of risk management, foreign aid, local capacity, response facilities, and enabling environment. At the end of the day, it was a balanced view at the end of the day. Are we optimistic or pessimistic about Nigeria's chances of controlling in the long term, or at least in the medium term, this virus? It was like equal. Some persons expressed reservations, though with some conditions that if we take the necessary urgent steps, we'll begin to be on top of the situation. But some others felt it's a lost opportunity. We just have to get ready to count the cost.
I think one issue that projected itself quite obviously from that discussion, which dovetailed from the previous town hall forum that are anchored on the issue of governance and containment, was the clear absence of a national strategy for containment of this. Unlike when we had the Ebola outbreak in Nigeria, where the federal government took charge and led the way and had a national strategy
and perhaps platform
and drove the process at that time. The situation as it is with the COVID-19 is not exactly the same as what happened. So from that discussion, it became obvious that there is a need for a clear-cut national strategy to contain such outbreaks when they do occur. We don't have it at the moment.
Yes. Lost opportunity. But anyway, remains lessons for the country and, of course, for us as journalists who keep putting an eye on what the government is doing as far as pandemics and response strategies are concerned. Amaechi was also busy during the next session, which held on Friday, the 22nd of May, and it was quite a very controversial subject matter. The controversy had been building up over time, even before, which was essentially the basis upon which that particular subject matter came up. That's COVID-19, understanding the infectious diseases bill, the uneasiness, prospect, and its relevance in battling the COVID-19 pandemic. Amaechi.
Quite controversial. Almost every other interest group had a position on it, and the panel reflected the different interest groups, the National Assembly members, the 3 members of the National Assembly, including the Speaker, then the other 2, the 2 chairmen in charge of the committees, 2 committees on health in the National Assembly, co-sponsored the bill. A whole lot of issues came up. Issue of originality. It was agreed that nearly 95% of the content of that bill were lifted from the Singaporean Infectious Disease Bill of 1977. That's some decades ago. Though we acknowledged and agreed that in parliamentary processes, in lawmaking, unlike in academics or elsewhere, or copyright, as in creative industry and entertainment, issue of plagiarism don't come in. You're free to lift legislations, proposed legislations from one part of the country to the other. So 95%. Some people argued, I keep talking about 97 because some people argued it was up to 97 of what was contained in that bill. So the first issue was originality. It was plagiarized, it was copied without some local uniqueness being factored in. How can you go to a Southeast Asian country in a law that was made in 1977? And one of the panelists pointed out that even Singapore is in the process of amending that act because, in their own opinion, it's outdated, it needs to be brought to tune with present-day reality. So they wonder why you want to copy something that is considered stale. That aside, the other controversies, very many of them, the other one was the issue of the powers conferred on the Director General of the NCDC. Perhaps we even looked at the issue of consultations before we come to the powers. Who were consulted? Were the relevant stakeholders? Did the National Assembly get their input into that bill? Because at the outset, the NCDC DG said he wasn't consulted. And
in fact, he even went further, Amaechi, in one of the town halls to say that he doesn't think that this is the best time to come up with a legislation on disease control during a pandemic.
It was inauspicious as far as the time is concerned. And these are the line the argument took. The state governors were not consulted. They were forced to issue a statement advising that the bill be withdrawn. For the CSOs, it was a total condemnation of the bill. Not now. It's too obnoxious. It confers. Now, let me come to the powers of the NCDC DG. The powers there, according to some of the panelists, some of them lawyers, are even much more than the powers of the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Because the proposed law suggested, or not suggested, if passed into law, courts of the land will not have the right to adjudicate on issues regarding to the DG of NCDC within those powers. It houses the jurisdiction of the court from it. So to some of the panelists, because we have a president who is limited by the Constitution, especially with the issues of rights and liberties, and you're creating an appointee of the zone, not a direct appointee, through the Minister of Health to wield enormous powers that it will meet a huge rock. It's like a fast train heading towards a rock. What do you expect? A head-on collision. Then the issue of the federal government usurping the powers of the state, excluding the bill, excluded the states in any infectious disease control and management by conferring so much powers on the NCDC. One of the panelists raised the issue of the present situation then where the states, where some of them were seen to be at the driver's seat. In fact, some of them are ahead of the federal government in response and management of COVID-19. If the states are playing such a pivotal role now, and you want to show them by the side when issues of infectious disease are concerned, what do you expect? The federal government may likely be overwhelmed. That the response management would be so enormous that it will be overwhelmed and they wouldn't go far. At the end of the day, we were joined also towards the end by one of the sponsors of the bill, even though the speaker was represented, who tried to give reasons behind that bill. He acknowledged that it's the work in progress. That's the idea. They initially refused, planned not to hold public hearing, but after much persuasions, they accepted there will be public hearing. And in that, that's Dr. Sununu acknowledged that they are ready to receive inputs from different interest groups in the country and possibly make amends as far as that bill is concerned.
So wait and see how
imputes that ought to have been harvested
before the bill was drafted.
Yes. And many of our panelists on that forum did say that the bill, the way it is, or the way it was presented to the House of Representatives, is very anti-democratic. Because first, it is coming from Singapore, that law was made as far back as 1977 or so, at a time when perhaps Singapore was not
under a dictatorship.
Was under a dictatorship, was not a democratic
state.
dispensation. So in bringing that bill wholesale to Nigeria, a democratic country, as it were, the sponsors of that bill ought to have consulted widely. They ought to have worked, imputed certain things that would take care of the domestic situation, which is not in the current bill.
I still remember too that some members of the House of Reps actually opposed the process in which that bill was presented before the House at the time.
The perceived haste that the promoters were.
There were concerns and there were even suspicions in some quarters about it, and of course that has dovetailed into a litigation because members of the public who felt there's something in this bill, they felt very strongly about it, and I think a couple of persons went
about
to court.
3 cases
went to court about it and are currently in court. But of course the legal matter didn't stop us because we didn't discuss anything that has to do with what is before the court. What we talked about was a public interest issue that was before the National Assembly, which we are at liberty to discuss as a media organization. Moving on from there, we also had to discuss the education, which was one of the key sectors of the COVID-19, and that subject matter actually held on the 26th of May, on Tuesday, 26th of May, and it was on COVID-19 lockdown, disruptive impact on education and 2019-2020 school calendar, alternative learning options, support programs, and parental responsibility. What I actually anchored this particular session. It was split into two sessions, the basic and tertiary. I took modules at the basic level of it. Amaechi will talk about some of the issues that took place at the tertiary segment of the program, where he had, of course, students from the university and some university lecturers as well. But for the basic education level, of course, there was a context to it. It came at the time that pupils had been at home. So most of them were supposed to have been concluding their second term in school. Midway into the second term was when the lockdown came into being, and a lot of children had to go back home, basically doing nothing. And but some state governments came up with some initiatives of providing lessons through the local TV stations and the radio networks as well. The federal government, through the PTF, also came up with the idea of using the NTA, the National Television Network, to broadcast tutorials to pupils. But the discussion actually identified the gaps in that system, especially as it has to do with the most vulnerable sections in our community. The fact that for private, because the discussion also had to, create a distinction between students in private schools and students in public schools. And for those in private schools, it was identified that, the parents may, relatively be able to send their kids to private schools. But the implication of doing homeschooling using e-learning methods or online methods was putting a drag on the income of the parents at a time when everybody was experiencing economic crunch.
Yes.
And how parents are going to meet up was also a challenge. And so we had the president of the FCT chapter of the Private School Proprietors Association, and she talked about how they're trying to reach out to parents. Some parents are thinking of having home teachers to come take care of their kids. But at the same time, they are also concerned whether these home teachers coming here have taken necessary precautions and whether they're safe. Yeah. Because at this point where everybody's supposed to stay at home, you can't begin to bring somebody who has been moving from one place to the other to your home without knowing the COVID-19 status. So it presented a whole lot of challenge. And also on the public school level, we talked about those in primary and secondary, and especially those in vulnerable communities. And we had the NUT represented through the Secretary General of the NUT, Dr. Ekene. We also had Irene Banwell, who spoke quite well. Judith Giwa Amu, who is of the UNICEF, coordinating education in emergency situations at federal and national levels. And in her opinion, the UNICEF actually doesn't have any policy per se. It works with local authorities, what the government has. It supports and provides technical assistance to it. And they talked about learning packets, which they feel was much more effective and provides a platform for evaluation, which is very key as far as education is concerned. But I talked about the issue of those involved in the villages. We are here in the city, and it looks quite okay. But from what one of the panelists said, Onibon of Change Initiators International, that from her assessment of public schools in some parts of the FCT, a lot of them are left out. So we may have what appears to be on TV. We've talked, government has come up with this, how has it trickled down to the people at the very base level? The child who has to support the mother to the market on a daily basis.
Yes.
Okay, we have 3 days, three market days now. So each of those 3 days, or perhaps those in farming communities, they have to go with their parents to the farm. There's no school, so go to farm and support the family. How do you expect that child to tune to a TV station or radio station at a certain time and say, it's time for study? Is the mental environment even okay for the child to pick up?
What else I also took away from your the town hall forum, because I think I watched a bit of it, is we should also give the children a break. I think it was the UNICEF guest that said it.
Break from education?
Yeah. No, we should just give the children a break, because everyone is trying to adjust to this time.
To the new normal.
Yes, to the new normal, because it's even difficult for the parents, let alone the children. And another thing she also said,
suffocate them with
yes, you shouldn't suffocate them in terms of there should be time. They should just, give them some kind of break. And for you as a parent, you are not the teacher. I think she said something
that was
like
Irene. That was Irene Bangwell. Don't
so
try to be a professor.
Yes, don't try to be the professor to your child at that time, because you can't be.
I think it was also fundamental that the point they made was also that some of these children that at home nothing is happening, the liberty to just be aloof is so great, and so provide some kind of routine for your children as well. Yeah. Let there be a sleep time and a wake up time, just as normal school period would be. Wake up time, breakfast, house chores, and the rest, and a time for study, even if it's just 2 hours or 3 hours a day. Let it be regular, so that Monday to Friday they have a routine that this is what they're going to fit in. It also helps their mental and psychological state.
Incidentally, I think that the first thing we need to deal with is the mental health of parents. Homework is not homework unless a child has been taught about it. That way, a parent plays a supervisory role. This is like a reality check. Education is totally different from parenting. So in order for a parent to wear the teacher's cap, they need to know the basics about teaching. Bottom line, if I wanted to talk to parents directly today, I want them to know that learning is not the same thing as it's time for lunch, go and pick your food to eat. Learning has a process to it. And I usually say that parents have a lot of resources they can use to guide learning. And what do I mean by this? In the process of teaching your child, a teacher probably has a definition with which your child is working with. Your responsibility is to explain, is to tell stories, is to answer questions. Don't suddenly carry upon yourself the burden that you're a professor. You are not, all right? You're just an assist, you're just guiding.
Well, so the COVID-19 disruption also affected the education sector, not just at the basic level, but also at the tertiary level, which was the second session of the day, which Amaechi Anakwue anchored. Amaechi, could you briefly take us through that session?
Yes, taking over from the basic aspect to the tertiary. We looked at a number of issues. Do we call it? We use different concepts to describe the alternatives: remote learning, e-learning, distant learning. Could it be an alternative form of education? No, that was the consensus. It can only complement the regular education system where the teacher interfaces with the students. Nothing can beat that. Sometimes the countenance of the teacher matters, and peer issues of peer learning, peer teaching play a lot of role. We've started with the views of a university student who acknowledge, a private university who acknowledge that distant learning is ongoing, but she would have preferred the regular education. So that's for private universities. We had a vice chancellor of Caritas University in our panel. He acknowledged that the demand are now even ready to go into some form of examinations. That's for the private schools. For the public, the president of the Academic Staff Union of Universities was among us. He told us clearly that nothing like that, nothing of such is taking place, even though government issued a directive that it should go on. In reality, it's not ongoing because the infrastructure is not present. You need to spend over time to deploy the infrastructure. I raised the example of a national open university. Can't we learn from it? Distant learning, but they raised up the issue of many organizations, including government institutions, a law school, National Youth Service, not extending the usual courtesies to other graduates of other tertiary institutions to the National Open University, so raising some suspicions around it, notwithstanding the fact that before now, anything open, distant learning is viewed with any certificate of such is viewed with some form of skepticism. But another consensus was that, yes, the infrastructure may not be here, it may not be strong enough, but it's something we can start with. Let's build on what we have going forward. In the course of our deliberations, there were interruptions, linking our guests via Zoom because of connection problems, so it came to the fore. It gave us a semblance of what the students are going through, but there was an appeal to the government to reach out to the telecoms companies, some form of arrange and negotiated data plan for students. Some persons, especially from some of our viewers, insisting that the government should take the next step by distributing laptops. They started some countries that are doing it, South Africa, Rwanda, name it, that they are doing it, is what we can do here. The parents' responsibility to all this is also very crucial. Most students will need the support of their parents by way of providing the funds and pointing out one or two gray areas if need be, especially if you fall into that trap of not having the opportunity to ask individually questions to your teacher. So at the end of the day, it does not exist or barely exist in the public institution, but the private institutions is going on well, is progressing very well. A lecturer from Base University also joined us and said, yes, they have even mastered it over time. But it's an opportunity we can key into going forward. Invest more on it. Let's try it out the more, and it can complement and not substitute education at the tertiary level.
Fantastic. Amaechi, I couldn't agree more, because most of the issues raised in that session actually laid the foundation or dovetail into the finale that we had on Friday, the 29th of March, because we're looking at the new norm in our society in different spheres of life, be it education, be it business, be it the corporate world, even in sports as well. How much COVID-19 disruption have changed everything and perhaps set up a new norm for the entire world, not just Nigeria. And so the topic for Friday, 29th of March, was post-COVID-19. 29th of May, sorry, was post-COVID-19, anticipated revolution in digital economy, business re-engineering, health policies, foreign aid and dependence, international travel and trade, global economic recovery, international oil prices, vaccinations, and national unity. These are almost all, and even much more, of the factors that have been affected globally by the COVID-19